Hi everybody, and welcome to today's webinar on AISL and broadening participation. I'm Grace Troxell, the Case Digital Librarian, and I'm joined today by Jamie Bell, our Case Project Director and PI, and Program Officers Bob Russell and Monya Ruffin from NSF. Before we get started, I'm just going to go over a couple logistical things. This webinar will be recorded. The recording will be made available within the next few days, and you will get it via email, and it will also be posted to our website, informalscience.org, on the NSF AISL landing page, and I'll send that link out to you in a moment. This is part of a series of webinars about the AISL solicitation, so I'd like to encourage you to watch some of the others as well as you prepare your proposals. We will be taking questions during the webinar. Most of them will be saved at the end, but as questions occur to you, please type them into the question box, and we'll try and get to as many as we can. Now I'm going to turn it over to Jamie.
Thank you, Grace, and hello everyone and welcome. I would like to particularly thank Grace Troxell and Ashley Gary of the Case staff who have really helped coordinate and plan, organize, and document these webinars with our Advancing Informal STEM Learning Program Officers. We're also grateful to the Association of Science and Technology Centers, whose platform we're using, which is where CASE is based here in Washington, D.C. And a big thank you to Bob, Monya, and all the AISL program officers who have really put a lot of thought, time, and energy into making this series of 5 webinars actually as informative as they can be. As Grace said, they're all the previous ones are now recorded and on our website on informalscience.org, and this one will be as well, this one on broadening participation. And this is an area of great interest and focus of CASE's work over the next 4 years as well in broadening participation. One example, if you search for the CASE Guide to Resources for Broadening Participation in STEM on the informalscience.org website, you'll find a kind of starter list of projects, mostly at NSF, that will give you just a sense of the landscape of the work that's been funded in this area. And so this webinar today will really dig deeply into that on the NSF side. So again, thank you, and I'm going to turn it back over to Grace, Bob, and Monya.
Okay. Thank you, Grace. I hope that everybody, and Jamie, thank you. I hope everybody can hear me okay. This is Monya Ruffin. I'm a program officer and a co-lead for the Advancing Informal STEM Learning Program. I'm going to be joined here today with my colleague, Bob Russell, who is also a program officer for the Advancing Informal STEM Learning Program. And we are going to talk with you today about broadening participation and its importance to the foundation, also its significance for advancing informal STEM learning.
Hi, Monya. Just to point out that participants can submit text questions throughout the presentation. We'll answer the majority of them via text, and then we will answer some of them when we take a couple of breaks during the session.
Thank you, Bob. Okay, so let's begin by talking about broadening participation within the context of the National Science Foundation. So for those of you who don't know, you may not know that the National Science Foundation has several core values. In fact, we have 5 at the moment that are very significant to us and really shape the work that we do, that we support. And those include scientific excellence, organizational excellence, learning, inclusiveness, and accountability for public benefit. You'll see that we've highlighted inclusiveness because that's very important to us, particularly as it relates to broadening participation, because that core value of inclusiveness really gets to the heart of what we think about when we talk about broadening participation. This inclusiveness aspect is highlighted in the NSF strategic plan for 2014 through 2018, And it really means seeking and embracing contributions from all sources, including underrepresented groups, regions, and institutions. If we look more specifically at broadening participation, we actually have a performance area that's highlighted in the NSF strategic plan that I mentioned earlier. The broadening participation performance area really challenges us to expand our efforts to increase participation from underrepresented groups and diverse institutions throughout the United States in all of our NSF activities and programs. So you'll notice that in this challenge to us in terms of performance area, that broadening participation is defined here. That's a question we get a lot, is what do we mean by broadening participation? And in fact, it's here in our performance area. It really involves underrepresented groups in STEM as well as diverse institutions. Broadening participation, we have several investment priorities. There are 4 of those priorities that are specific to broadening participation. The first is very much about workforce development. So it's preparing a diverse and globally energized STEM workforce. So you'll find that many of our programs across the foundation are about workforce development, specifically, not specifically, but I would say in particularly within the Education Directorate, and even more specifically, I would say we even have a division that's really focused on broadening participation. And that division is our EHR division, which is Education and Human Resources. So it's HRD, it's Human Resource Development. Our second area is integrating research with education and building capacity. We are very much interested in research that helps us to think more about broadening participation and our strategies for that type of research and for building capacity. In addition, as I mentioned earlier, we want to expand our efforts to reach underrepresented groups and diverse institutions across geographical regions in all of our activities, not just those that we fund, but then some of our other activities, such as the 4th bullet that you see here, which is about improving processes to recruit and select highly qualified reviewers and panelists. Again, we're looking for reviewers that represent not only broad expertise, but that really come from some of these underrepresented groups in STEM and work at diverse institutions. And these institutions, by the way, include informal science education institutions. It includes colleges and universities, community-based institutions. It's quite broad in the definition of diverse institutions, but we really want to build a really strong and diverse cadre in terms of our STEM workforce. But even more than that, as I'll talk about a little bit later in AISL, we're really interested in also reaching public audiences. Something you may not know is that within the National Science Foundation, we do maintain and really look at our broadening participation portfolio. Within our broadening participation portfolio, we have 3 different categories in which we categorize our programs, but also helps us to kind of evaluate what we're doing within broadening participation across the foundation. So when we look at these 3 categories, the first category includes programs that are primarily focused on broadening participation. So these would be programs such as Includes, which some of you may have heard of, our F-Score program, which is really helping us to reach out to kind of underfunded locations, states within our country to reach them. We also have our HBCU UP program, TCUP. There's a range of programs that fall into this category. The next category would be our broadening participation, emphasis programs. There are several that fall into that category. One of those is AISL, in fact. The Advancing Informal STEM Learning Program does fall into this category because we don't require that our projects focus on broadening participation. A good number of our projects do, and we do have special criteria. So we fall within this category along with other programs like Computer Science for All, the Innovative Technology Experiences for Students and Teachers Program, GRFP, and others. The third category, in which we look at programs and opportunities, I would say more opportunities within the foundation that are specific to broadening participation, includes our Dear Colleague letters. So we've had a number of Dear Colleagues letters come out in recent years. They're a little different than our solicitations. They tend to be very specific, and they tend to also have oftentimes a shorter time frame in terms of when the deadlines are, and they may only be relevant or active for a year or two. So we have a current Dear Colleague letter out right now, for instance, around Life STEM that really targets minority serving institutions. We've had one come out around the transition of students from 2-year Hispanic serving institutions to 4-year HBCU research capacity, a number of opportunities. But for the purposes of today's webinar, we really fall under the second category, which are those broadening participation emphasis programs. Now, how do you actually see the broadening participation portfolio? In order to see that portfolio, you'll need to go to our NSF.gov homepage. When you go to the NSF.gov homepage, you can click on the menu bar at the top right corner. You'll see that there's a link that says About NSF. When you click on that link, you will then receive another, you'll see another drop down, and let's see here, see if I can get us there. All right, and it's going to say broadening participation / diversity. When you click on that third link, you'll be brought to, you'll go to this area on the right side of the slide, which is the home page for the broadening participation portfolio. On this page, you'll be able to see several different programs and opportunities that we offer. I'm going to turn it over now to my colleague, Bob, to talk about broadening participation and EHR. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Monya. If you could put the next slide up. So as Monya has already stated, NSF has a very strong emphasis on excellence in all the STEM areas, as well as ensuring a broad, diverse, and well-prepared workforce. And I think with respect to AISL, you can think about this in two ways. One is that NSF has strong emphasis on developing a well-prepared and diverse workforce. But the other reference in the last sentence, or the last phrase in this mission statement, is a well-informed citizenry. And that means everybody. So that means that we would like everybody to be engaged in science and to be well-informed on science, because we want everyone to be able to enjoy science, and we also want everyone to be able to participate in, in a civic way with respect to science by voting, with respect to their issues in science and other areas, as well as being involved in policy decisions that are being made at governments at all levels, which are often well informed by science. So, and then when you want to look at research and investment themes of NSF science, or NSF and EHR, one of those themes is STEM learning and learning environments. And one important thing is that NSF is a research agency. And so the NSF has a heavy emphasis on research. So the AISL proposals should be researching issues related to broadening participation so that we can gain additional insights there. And thank you, the slides are back now. A second theme is broadening participation in institutional capacity. And so what that means is increasing the capacity of museums, media, and other institutions in our society to engage underrepresented populations through high quality STEM education, media productions, and other means of getting engaged in science. The third investment theme is the STEM workforce. And while the AISL program itself doesn't have STEM workforce as its mission, there are other NSF programs such as the iTest, the Innovative Technology Experiences for students and teachers that does have a specific focus on workforce, but workforce development can be an important theme in an AISL project. It's not required, but it can be a useful theme. And what do we mean by broadening participation and institutional capacity in STEM within EHR? Well, just to kind of reiterate, that is to build the capacity of our organizations to involve all people in STEM learning and professional training, and then especially those that are traditionally underrepresented in science. And the groups that are traditionally underrepresented in science, some of them are well known, such as Latinos, African Americans, girls, but some others may not be reflected on as much with respect to AISL projects. And so those can include persons that have learning challenges, learning disabilities, challenges of that sort. And then in addition, rural areas. Many rural areas are underserved with respect to STEM education because they may not have a science museum in their area, or they may not have many of the science programs that you might find in more heavily populated areas. So, this is certainly not a complete list of groups and communities that could be considered underrepresented in science, but you can think broadly about the various range of communities and groups of people that, for one reason or another, have not had an opportunity or have not had access to high-quality STEM education programs. So let's focus now on broadening participation in AISL. And I believe that Monya is going to talk about the next several slides.
Okay, thanks, Bob. So now we're going to talk about how we think about broadening participation within the Advancing Informal STEM Learning Program. So within the Advancing Informal STEM Program, and but actually within our Directorate for Education and Human Resources, we have several priority areas. Right now, we want to talk about the priority areas that are specific to the AISL program, and there are 6. Maximizing strategic impact, enhancing knowledge building, promoting innovation, advancing collaboration, strengthening infrastructure, and building capacity, and then we have broadening participation. This is not, by the way, in order of importance to us. This is just a listing of the priorities, and it's in a nice position for us to transition to the next slide, which is specifically about broadening participation. There's a lot of text here on this slide. There's a lot of good information here, which you can also see in our solicitation. What I want to do is just highlight some of the key points that's embedded within this text around broadening participation. For us in the Advancing Informal STEM Learning Program, we are contributing to the NSF mission through our work as an emphasis program. One of the aspects of our work around broadening participation that can make us a little different than some of the other programs within the foundation is that we are very much about public and professional engagement in STEM. So we are reaching out to audiences and individuals who might not necessarily engage actively in STEM. Many of those individuals come from underrepresented, underserved groups in STEM. And so we're really proud of that work because it does help the foundation to achieve its mission in informal learning. We also have let's see here, I have plenty of notes here. We're also interested in informing our citizenry, and then also there's workforce development. There's a lot of work that we fund that's really specific to building a strong cadre of and diverse STEM workforce. So that also helps us to contribute to the NSF's mission. Diversity is important to us. As we mentioned earlier, diversity can be described in many different ways, and so we are happy to support work that is helping to meet that goal. In addition, I mentioned earlier that we're very much interested in broadening participation research. And for AISL, that can come in many different forms. It could be broadening participation work that's really helping to achieve access for diverse communities through looking at STEM learning outcomes, looking at organizational capacity, and also looking at field-wide mechanisms, again, that are expanding access to STEM through resources and experiences. And then finally, like most programs within the foundation, we are very much interested in receiving proposals from organizations that serve or target underrepresented groups and communities. Okay. So one of the criteria for being a broadening participation emphasis program is that you have an additional review criteria that is specific to broadening participation. And we have those criteria within the Advancing Informal STEM Learning Program, and they are listed in our solicitation 17-573 that just came out. But you know, this video may be used for other webinars, but for right now, that criteria is there, and it's around broadening participation. And we are really looking at projects that have a primary goal of broadening participation to address the two criteria that are listed here. The first one that speaks to characteristics and needs. I'll give you an opportunity to read the statement there. But what I will say about it is that when you are addressing this first question, we are really looking for you or the PI to tell us more about, it could be the demographics of the group, tell us more about the targeted population. If you know that the group is includes individuals who are artistic, we want you to tell us more about what that means, what the research says about reaching that population. And we want to know what their needs are, that you are aware of their needs, you've considered their needs. And so we need for our proposals to really list that out for us, to give us the confidence that the group really knows this community and has what's needed, the resources, the expertise to address the needs of this group. Another example, if your group is underserved, we want to know what that means. What does underserved mean for your community, and what are some of those implications? If the community is low income, there may be particular needs because that group or your target audience is a low income group. Maybe that creates challenges for certain kinds of needs like transportation. It could be some needs regarding work and workforce development, especially when families are involved. Are the parents available because of different hours that they're working? And so maybe there's certain considerations that need to be in place. That's maybe similar for rural communities. Transportation, again, can be be something to consider. And then certainly disabilities, as I mentioned, autistic communities or visually impaired communities. Tell us about those needs, and then tell us about the population, but then also the needs. If we take a look at the second question here, it's very much specific to plans and strategies for addressing and accommodating the needs of the community that you have described or would have described in the first bullet. So these are your plans. So you are articulating, you're giving us a bit of an outline to let us know how you're going to address some of the characteristics such as underserved, underrepresented, low income, rural, disability, all of those kinds of things. So if it's transportation that you know is going to be a need, in the second bullet, you're telling us that you're going to get a van to ensure that you can transport the communities or the individuals, the students, to back and forth to wherever your program is, so that they can be engaged and you have the maximum possibility of a very diverse group of participants. You don't want the transportation to be a barrier. Maybe you have a high percentage of students or individuals who speak another language as their native language. Maybe they're English language learners. And so you've told us that in this first bullet, but now what you're telling us is that maybe perhaps one of your plans is to have bilingual personnel, bilingual staff. You're going to have materials, resources that will be available in their native languages or the other language that's spoken in the home or that they speak most often. So we want to know that you not only can tell us about the community, but you know their needs and that you have strategies in place. Now, this being said, that was really for a primary goal of broadening participation. But sometimes we get proposals that may say that their target audience includes middle school students, and there will be students of which some may be visually impaired. And then the proposal proceeds as if the visually impaired students weren't mentioned. And maybe that's not the goal. Maybe the goal are, middle school students who have all their visual capacities. But if that is a secondary goal, and you know that the students may be involved who have these impairments and may need special accommodations, then that may be a secondary goal, and therefore we do expect for you to show that you're familiar with that population as well, and that you've really thought about the communities and what's needed there. So be really sure that if you mentioned any groups that may fall under the underrepresented categories for us, or one of the categories, that you should make sure that you address their needs, describe their characteristics, and give us a plan in some way. You may not need to actually respond directly to the 2 review criteria if it's not a primary goal, but we do expect that you can demonstrate knowledge and collaboration with those target communities. Before I move to the next slide, I just want to also mention, when you think about addressing these goals, another strategy or a couple of different strategies that we really like to see as well is that you have partnerships and collaborators that have worked and have expertise as well in working with these communities if you have underrepresented communities. It's a bonus, actually, especially if your evaluators have also had that experience, if you have a project that involves having an evaluation. Your research team, we really want to see that you have a plan. So just keep that in mind. Partnerships, collaborators, and experts are also really important. So I'm going to start us off. Bob and I have prepared some portfolio exemplars to share with you around broadening participation. I'm going to talk about one, and then Bob is going to talk about a couple more here in our last few minutes. Before I move to the next slide, I just want to encourage you to continue to submit questions to us, and we will be taking a look at those questions in our last 10 or 15 minutes and really try to answer any questions that you may still have for us. If you have very specific questions about your particular project, then you would probably do best by reaching out to one of us directly via email, and then we can respond to your question there. Okay, let's look at some portfolio exemplars. So the Youth Radio Innovation Lab is one of our more recent awards, and it's a really fantastic project around youth radio. It's a media project that's targeting 14 to 24-year-olds, where they are working with and have created a multimedia 6-part series working with scientists, industry leaders. They've developed apps all around different issues that are specific to their communities, and they've been hosting live events with some of the STEM researchers and industry folks they've been reaching out to. What's really fantastic about it is the diversity of the students, and this project really does a nice job of broadening participation because it has reached hundreds of youth in California and Georgia and DC. And many of the youth are coming from different communities and are involved in these activities through their community centers. These are low-income youth, and most of them, if not all of them, are youth of color. And so it's just been really great to watch this project evolve and to see the work that's coming out of the Youth Radio project that's really reaching students in ways that they may not have even thought about before in terms of radio and what's happening within STEM media radio. So this is the Youth Radio project, and you can look it up. You can do an award search to find out more. You can put in the AISL 1323791 award number and learn more about it. You'll get this presentation later, so you can look it up at that time. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Bob now to talk about the last two or three exemplars, and then we'll move into questions. Okay, Bob?
All right, thank you, Monya. Well, the first project I'd like to discuss is CHISPA, Children Investigating Science with Parents and After School. This project is led by the Frost Museum of Science in Miami, and the museum, in previous years, the museum had developed an after-school science curriculum called APEX, and it was in English, and it was designed to just be of general interest, to after-school programs, and it included a variety of hands-on activities for students in grades 3 through 6. This proposal I'm talking about right now, the mission of the proposal is to make those activities accessible to Latino kids and families. What the project did is number one, they adapted their English language activities into Spanish. They did some, they obviously adapted the language into Spanish, but they also tested some of those activities to make sure that they would be effective with Latino kids and parents. And they recruited 11 museum partners, and they also recruited National Consuelo Raza and Aspira, two of the largest Latino organizations, to work with them in the development of the project and to provide assistance in developing the professional development component for the museum staff. And so the project has to get back to the two review-specific criteria. Well, obviously Latino kids are targeted in this particular program, although any children are welcome to participate in the after-school programs that are part of the project. And so obviously they have a means of engaging Latino students, recruiting Latino students. That's one thing. They considered by the nature of the very project, they considered the specific needs of those kids and took the activities through a testing and evaluation process to assure that the activities would be engaging and would be effective with the specific audience, namely Latino kids. And they also engaged parents in the program, both to gain parental support for the program and also to make their parents more comfortable in doing science with their own kids at home. So that, in a nutshell, is the program. And the evaluations have shown that kids do learn STEM concepts that are presented in the program, and that the parents feel more comfortable in doing science with their kids at home. And one other impact of the program has been that 11 science museums have recruited community organizations in their communities, and those 11 science museums are now active in offering an after-school program to target Latino kids in particular. One thing I'd like to point out is that the APEX program was funded by the first grant award number you see below there, and then this project is the second number referred to. So I guess my point there is that sometimes these projects are developed over quite a number of years. The 04 stands for 2004, and the 13 at the beginning of the second number is 2013. So many projects are long-term initiatives, and so the Frost Science Museum has had a long-standing commitment to engaging Latinos in science, and they've spent a long period of time developing effective strategies of doing that. And so, Monya, if you'd like to put up the next slide. Okay, the next program is a nice example of a project that was specifically designed to reach rural communities. This particular project takes place in Maine, and in a nutshell, this program is designed to recruit leaders in rural communities who would identify relevant science resources in their regions, and then they would, in addition, try to recruit youth aged 10 to 18 to assist in becoming involved in some of these programs, and in some cases also presenting and designing some of the programs. So what the project did is they developed a network of a number of communities across Maine, and they recruited several hundred leaders in these various communities who would identify the science education resources in their communities, and who would also facilitate, train, support youth in their activities in these programs. And the programs, there are several examples of programs: teen science cafes, math in the garden, engineering is everywhere, and I also know they recruited some citizen science projects. So the idea here was to recruit the many science resources that are even available in rural areas, and some of those would be available online. One interesting aspect is that libraries were often the hub of activities in many of these communities. So what this program has done is it's recognized the needs in rural communities. There are not typically science museums in rural communities, and there may be fewer science programs that are immediately available. So what they have tried to do is to identify those that are available and make them accessible through the leaders and through the youth participants, and in some cases develop some new activities, and to use a well-known hub of the community, libraries, as the focal point for some of these activities. And so that's one interesting trend that's been happening overall in informal programs, is using libraries as a community location for science, and that's particularly a relevant location in rural areas. Okay, the third project that I'm going to present is the NSF overall has funded a rich variety of projects targeting persons that have one or more learning challenges in accessing science. So in this case, this is for blind and visually impaired youth. So the project wanted to develop a national model for introducing and educating blind youth through venues like museums, science centers, and other venues. And the project also wanted to involve parents of blind children. So what the project did was to recognize some of the obvious challenges that those students that are blind would have in using typical science museum exhibits, for example. where there are exhibit labels and instructions and other things that enable you to just even to have access to the experience. So what the project did is they worked together with blind students and with science museums and other organizations to develop some approaches to adapting those experiences so that they were very accessible to students that were blind, and teachers were also involved so that they could take advantage of some of these approaches that were used so that they could implement those in the classroom. The net result is that their partnerships were developed with 6 science centers and museums, to be involved in the development process of these overall approaches. And the result of the summative evaluation showed the students that they believed they had improved their STEM skills and science contents, and they were much more confident in their ability to become involved in science. The institutions that were involved in this program developed a richer range of sensitivity and also expertise in making their exhibits and other programs available to blind students. And these resources are now available to other science museums and other institutions that would benefit from making their activities accessible to students who have visual impairments or who are blind. And so in this case, the project had a means for recruiting blind students. They had a venue where the project could take place, and the specific focus of the project was to make accommodations in the way that these students can experience hands-on exhibits and other informal learning experiences, given that they can't read the instructions and other information about whatever the activity was. So I think all 4 of these examples have shown that all these projects identified a specific target population and analyzed what the needs of that population, what their needs were, developed strategies to address those specific needs in particular, and then in most cases made the resources, approaches, and other elements of their projects available to other organizations who weren't immediately involved in the project. So those are, I think, are good examples, of how your project can be designed, to effectively engage and meet the needs of the specific target population that you have in mind serving in your project. So I think now that we'll take some questions, and since I've been talking, I haven't been monitoring the questions. So Monya, did any questions come up that we should try to respond to?
Okay, give me just a second. Let me see if I can pull those up here. Okay. And while we get set to take your questions, we just want to encourage you to please go ahead and continue to submit questions. I'll see if I can answer a couple of them. Let's see here. Okay, so there's a great question here that says, the solicitation says that projects do not need to address all 6 priority areas. Is there an exception, though, that all proposals address broadening participation? Okay, so it is correct. You are not required to address all 6 of the priority areas as stated in the solicitation. And actually, you don't have to address broadening participation. That's one of the factors that makes us different as an emphasis program as opposed to a focus program. So our focus programs do require that broadening participation is present and addressed in all of its proposals and opportunities that are funded by those specific programs, like includes, for instance, or the Innovative Technology Experiences for Students and Teachers iTest program. But the AISL program is not considered to be a BP, a broadening participation focused program. So therefore, no. all of our proposals are not expected to address broadening participation. Okay, let's see. I may be able to do one more. Let's see. There's a question about, okay, the question is it better to choose a single underrepresented group, or can we combine a project with several groups? Well, I think it depends on the project in terms of whether or not you want to focus on only one group or several. We see a combination. We have projects that are very much about African American males, and so that is the research that they present. They have presented the methods for how they're working. They've presented the case for the need. Let me say that. They've presented the strategies, and so they're really working to have impact for African American males, for instance. We also have projects like Sci Girls. There's a project that's specific to Latina, actually, I should say, Latina girls. And so that's a very specific group. But many of our projects actually do have a combination of groups that they are working with, because the communities of which they work are not homogeneous. And so it just really depends on the focus of the research and development work that you want to do, on whether or not you choose to do a single group or not. The one other thing I would say, though, is that for whatever you choose to do, make sure that you are addressing those criteria for the groups that you're addressing, because each of your groups, if you do more than one, may have very different needs. And so you want to make sure that you address those.
Yeah. I can offer an example of a project that does target a variety of groups that are underserved in science. There's a project out of the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, Citizen Science Project, and the focus of the project is developing partnerships with community organizations. So that's the focus of the research, is how do you develop, how does a project develop a good relationship with a community organization that may specifically focus on Latinos, African Americans, Laotians, a wide variety of groups. So the question is kind of a general one of across these various groups. Are there some approaches that are effective across all these types of community organizations that are very, very effective and helpful in developing a relationship with an organization like that, so that the program can serve the people that are served by that community organization. So there's an example of something where the questions are kind of general across community organizations. And that proposal, they'd probably still have to talk about some of the specific target populations, but the focus would be the questions are more general about community organizations rather than focusing on one or more specific groups. Let's see, there's another question. Is it possible to adapt an already existing program like APEX for a new grant? Well, they did it, so the simple answer is yes. And if you are doing that, then probably the adaptation, it would to a degree depend on what the adaptation was, and you'd want to have an effective process for doing that. It would be more than just simply translating something into another language. That wouldn't really be a research. There would be no research question involved in something like that, and there might be some cultural issues that should be addressed in the adaptation. And so all AISL projects have to have some research issues that are being looked into, and so there are probably some issues that could be addressed through the adaptation process that might result in answering some research questions of broad interest to the field. And in all cases there are in many cases there's no pat answer for a question like that. So generally, yes, you could consider doing that, and you'd probably want to talk to a program officer about the specifics to make sure that besides adapting something, does your project have some research questions that would be of broad interest to the field? You want to take another one, Monya?
I'll go ahead and jump in. There's a question here about research versus outreach. and the program's kind of interest in that way. So for us, I think what you're saying is basically research and development work. And so what I would say to that is that the AISL program does fall within the Division for Research on Learning. And so we are definitely very much about research, very much interested in research. We want projects that are looking at very critical questions and issues and really looking to address those through rigorous methods, methodologies, and analysis work. So we are very much a research program. We, in fact, have expanded our solicitation to provide more opportunities to get really good, solid, rigorous research underway, completed, and also that analysis and reporting. We really need to hear more on many different areas of informal science education. So to that end, I will say that if you're interested in broadening participation research, because we actually have projects that are looking at working with particular groups. They're exploring different aspects around identity, motivation, interests, achievement, all kinds of different variables that's really about broadening participation research. But then you also may be interested in doing research that includes some of the underrepresented groups and institutions that we mentioned previously. We've expanded our solicitation so that now you can actually also do review literature. You can do literature reviews. You can do synthesis report. There's the opportunity for meta-analyses. We've kind of renamed and reframed what used to be pathways is now called pilots and feasibility studies. We have research and service to practice. And then we do still have the innovations and development and broad implementation project types. But again, while those do kind of emphasize the development piece of it, we do expect most of our, if not all, I would probably say all of our projects at this point, to have a research emphasis. So while maybe the examples we gave, we didn't underscore the research component, and we'll be sure to do that in the future, we don't want to mislead you. We are definitely a research program.
Okay, well, we've got a question. The exemplar projects referenced seem to focus on model program development and community outreach. Yeah?
That's the question that I just addressed.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was trying to see what questions we hadn't addressed and not paying attention.
Okay. All right, let's see. Is there another one that you see that maybe we can get in these last 5 minutes that may be something relevant for the entire group?
Well, there was one question where the question was, how does the AISL program define rural areas? And you know, we don't have, you know, a very specific definition of rural areas. I mean, obviously it would be less populated areas, and the areas that have been referred to as rural in projects that have been funded would be, for example, you know, rural areas of Maine. You know, when you get outside of Portland or some of the other larger communities in Maine, that would be rural. Another example would be we funded a project, I believe, in Nebraska that was outside of Omaha or Lincoln, the two largest cities, and so that would be rural. There's a project called StarNet, which is circulating exhibits through libraries, and so a number of those libraries are located in smaller communities, and so that would be considered rural. So I don't know if that's helpful, but it's primarily the kind of general definition is in less populated areas. And Monya mentioned earlier that a number of states are identified as EPSCoR states. Those are states where there's some additional funding to support research funding in those states. Like my home state, Nebraska, is an EPSCoR state, and it doesn't receive as many NSF grants as, let's say, Massachusetts, which has, you know, lots of research institutions in Boston. And so many of those EPSCoR states are rural states, and the EPSCoR funding in some cases helps those states get additional research funding. And so through AISL, maybe some of the projects that are targeting rural areas might benefit from that funding.
Okay, I was just going to make one more comment that I wanted to add with rural, and really with any definition, it's really the onus is on you as the PI to really make the case for why you consider the community to be rural. And so you'll have to look at perhaps some of the local definitions and determinations that have been made in your local area. It's the same when you're describing the community that you're working with and even your institution. What makes it underserved or in need or at risk? So these are all words that we're going to really look to you to also make that case for us.
Okay, question just put up was, could you provide the research question of some of your exemplars so we have a better understanding of the program development process? Just on the spot now, I can't do that specifically, but I'll try to offer a couple of examples of research questions. So, for example, you know, in a project focusing on Latinos, you know, there are some cultural issues that might be addressed, you know, and so Latinos overall, there may be some family values that are stronger in Latino communities than in other communities, and so there may be specific approaches to designing a project that would respond to that. And there's been a fair amount of research on Latino families and family values, so you could structure research questions around that past research, and then the program design would be designed to address those specific aspects to make the project more effective. So that might be an example of a research question of what's the research on family structures and values in Latino families, and how is this program using that research to guide the development of a program to more effectively engage families in STEM. I don't know, Monya, do you have any examples of research questions that would be specifically linked to a particular, well, like another example would be girls, and so you could look up some of the projects that AISL has funded that have targeted girls in particular, such as the Sci Girls project that Monya referenced earlier, and there are some obvious issues related to girls and designing programs so that they're designed specifically to engage girls, and so that they're, you know, the messages coming out of the program, you know, don't implicitly discourage girls from becoming involved in science. So there's been a, you know, so you could base a variety of research questions on the large body of research that now exists on engaging girls and women in science.
So I'm cognizant of the time. We have now reached the hour mark, and so I'm going to close this out by saying thank you for joining us today for this presentation on broadening participation and informal STEM learning. We hope that it was helpful to you. If you have additional questions, do let us know. And we also want to say a special thank you for the CASE team for helping to organize and coordinate this webinar and the other webinars for us. This is the last webinar in this series. If you've enjoyed this webinar series and have other suggestions for us, do let us know. You can send us an email, and I forgot the alias. Is it DRL AISL programs? Do you know it, Bob?
Not off the top of my head, but
I don't know it off the top of my head either. Okay.
I do. It's DRL AISL at nsf.gov.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Grace. All right. Thank you for your time. Bye-bye.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Monya, Bob, Grace, and Ashley. This is Jamie again saying that all the webinars will be recorded on informalscience.org, and all of the examples that Bob and Monya offered today have project descriptions and/or spotlights on the informalscience.org website. So good luck with your proposal development, and keep in touch with case at informalscience.org and DRL AISL at nsf.gov. Thank you.